Hi guys, welcome to this revision video on poverty and the Cratchits. So on the screen you can just see a couple of key words that I need you to keep in mind today. That A Christmas Carol is an allegory, which is basically a story in which a character, place or event is used to deliver a broader message about the real world issues, and the writer's purpose, that you must remember that this was written by Dickens to provide a key message. You need to be able to talk about what the writer was trying to communicate through the writing. So today we're going to be looking at the Cratchits and what Dickens was trying to communicate through these characters. So we're going to be analysing some text, we're going to be doing some planning and some knowledge recall, and then a little bit of independent writing for you to practice at the end. On the next slide you're going to see 9 questions. That's going to feature over a few different slides, and I'm going to play some podcasts. You are going to use the information learnt on those podcasts to answer those questions at the end.
Bob Cratchit is Ebenezer Scrooge's long-suffering clerk. When we first see Bob, he is bitterly cold and struggling to work on Christmas Eve by a fire with a single coal in it and attempting to warm his fingers on the flame of a candle. He is being closely observed by his employer, Mr. Scrooge, and is frightened to ask for more coal to replenish his fire, as he is sure that he would be fired if he did.
When Fred, Scrooge's nephew, enters and tries to persuade his uncle to attend Christmas dinner with himself and his wife, the clerk listens to Fred's speech. It sums up the spirit of Christmas and serves to inform others of Fred's generous nature. Cratchit spontaneously applauds, demonstrating his own desire for the welfare of his own family and the spirit with which he approaches Christmas time. Unfortunately, this contrasts with his fire finally being extinguished, suggesting that when in the presence of Ebenezer Scrooge, all jollity, happiness and kindness are dismissed as humbug.
When we next see Bob, it is with his family on Christmas Day. The ghost of Christmas Present has made the Cratchits' small 4-roomed home one of the stops on his leg of Scrooge's journey.
Bob appears carrying Tiny Tim into the bosom of his family. He is greeted by his wife and 6 children and prepares to carve the goose that is dinner for Christmas Day. The description of Bob's amazement at the size and taste of the dinner shows the reader that he is exaggerating. When the narrator describes the bone left from the bird as one small atom, we understand that the meal has been modest, yet a feast to the Cratchits. This symbolises their extreme poverty and demonstrates to the reader the state of many people in the industrialised London in which the novel is set.
Bob is a mild man who is badly treated by Scrooge, yet he echoes the kindness of Fred when he toasts Mr. Scrooge's health and calls him the founder of the feast. Indeed, it has been Scrooge that has paid for the dinner through Bob's wages, but being so mean has ensured that the Cratchits' Christmas Day has been a meagre one.
It is Scrooge's introduction to Tiny Tim that allows the reader to see the beginning of the change in Scrooge. Tiny Tim is Bob Cratchit's youngest son, who is disabled. He is described in terms of timidity and frailty, as his hand is withered and he feebly cried, "Hurrah!" When he utters his now famous words, "God bless us, everyone," Scrooge and the reader alike are humbled in the presence of a little boy, who has the generosity and spirit to bless not only his family, but Scrooge, the spirit, and each and every one of the readers witnessing the scene.
It is within Tiny Tim that Dickens exploits sentimentality in order to secure pity from his target audience of the middle and upper classes. Dickens continues to pull on our heartstrings as Scrooge asks the ghost of Christmas Present, "Tell me if Tiny Tim will live." The ghost replies in the negative, saying, "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die."
We do not know the source of Tiny Tim's disability or the sickness that causes his death. Scrooge sees the Cratchits comforting one another after Tim has died, when he is visited by the ghost of Christmas yet to come. However, Scrooge's change of heart prevents this sad ending. We are reassured that charity can save lives as Tiny Tim survives and is given the last words in the novel, "God bless us, everyone."
Now you've listened to the podcast, pause the video and answer the following questions. Okay, so every year we get advice from AQA as to how to approach these questions. So this advice should help you. So one of the assessment objectives is called AO2, and this is all about how the writers use methods to communicate imagery and ideas. It's worth emphasising that there are many more methods than language devices such as metaphors and similes. So you can use phrases like the setting. So we could talk about how the dark, cold Victorian London setting that Scrooge trudges around in contributes to the effect of the story. You can talk about the characters and the presentation of the characters. So Tiny Tim is a deliberate construct. Dickens made him disabled and tiny to emphasise the ideas around poverty. And you can also talk about structure, as well as all the language choices. So this is just like Paper 1, question 4. Evaluate the methods used. You can talk about tone, similes, colour imagery, setting, the establishment of characters, dialogue, anything that you've learned from the language papers you can reference on here. So here's an example question. How does Dickens construct the characters in A Christmas Carol to examine attitudes towards the poor in Victorian London? So you could talk about how each one of the characters is created by Dickens to create a set, image. So for example, we know that Scrooge at the start embodies the Malthusian viewpoint. He's hard and sharp as flint. He's solitary as an oyster. His dialogue reveals to us that he doesn't care about the poor. Bar humbug, reduce the surplus population. He is a construct created to highlight the attitudes towards the Victorian poor. Okay, so there's a little task for you to attempt here. You are going to write a paragraph to explain how Dickens uses each Cratchit character to explore Victorian attitudes towards poverty. So I've done an example here using Bob. So look at this. How does Dickens use the character of Bob to show ideas around Victorian poverty? So I've looked at this quote. The clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal, but he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room. So I've considered that quote, and now I'm going to consider how Bob's character highlights the issues with Victorian poverty. So my response here is Dickens presents Bob as impoverished due to the poor wages and cruelty of his employer, Scrooge. The selfishness of the rich is thrown through the two fires in the office, with Bob's much smaller than Scrooge's. The fact that Bob is so cold but cannot improve his situation without help from Scrooge represents the cold attitude of many of the rich in Victorian London towards the poor. So what I want you to do is, following that model, I want you to think about the presentation of Tiny Tim and the presentation of Mrs. Cratchit. I've given you a sentence starter and quotes to get you started. Pause the video now and complete that task. Okay, so just a reminder of what this examination is going to look like. So you'll be given one extract and you will have 45 minutes to respond. So remember, whatever you're studying right now, knowledge is key. You need to know as much as possible about these texts. You need to know what happens in each section. So you've got an example there. So it will tell us where the extract has come from. So which chapter, which stave, and it will tell us what's happening. You will then be given the extract, and then you've got the question at the bottom. So this one is, starting with his extract, explore how Dickens presents attitudes towards Christmas within Victorian London. So this is the moment where Mrs. Cratchit brings out the Christmas pudding out of the copper. So you want to talk about how the attitudes to Christmas is shown within this extract, and then you want to pick another example of where else we see an attitude to Christmas. So a perfect example will be Scrooge at the start with his bar humbug, burying people with a sprig of holly in their heart. Christmas is a time for having no money and paying bills. Okay, so if you would like, you can pause the video now and you can have a go at that question. The question that I'm interested in today is this one. How does Dickens use the Cratchits to explore the struggles of the poor in Victorian London? I think the Cratchits are key characters and very often overlooked. So we want to think about how Dickens uses the Cratchits to explore the struggles of the poor in Victorian London, and we want to think about how Dickens uses the Cratchits to explore the struggles of poor in Victorian London in the whole novel. So what you need to do is you need to focus on the key words. So remember, the key words here are the Cratchits, that explore the struggles of poor in Victorian London. We then want to read the extract and we want to plan the essay. You're looking for 3 or 4 quotations from that extract. So remember, highlight anything that relates to the plight of the poor and then select your 3 highest leverage quotes. Which ones can you see most about? Remember the way I teach you to plan this. So on the left hand side are the quotes that you're going to talk about from the extract. On the right hand side is where that links. So the image of the Christmas pudding coming out of the copper is a perfect contrast with Scrooge's explanation of what he would do to people who celebrate Christmas, who say Merry Christmas. He will bury them with a sprig of holly, in their heart rather than the pudding. Then you want to write your claim, your thesis statement in your introduction. Answer the question and make a link to the context. What are you arguing here? Remember my metaphor of bowling? Yeah, how are you set that up? How are you setting this up for your examiner? Okay, so here's the question again. How does Dickens use the Cratchit to explore the struggles of the poor in Victorian London? You're going to write about the Cratchits in this extract, and then you're going to write about the Cratchits in the rest of the novella. So step 1, what are the key words? Step 2, plan and analyse the extract opposite. Remember to annotate your own copy. You want 3 of the best quotes, and then you want to plan 3 other important parts from the novella. So think about that essay plan that I use all the time, make one of your own. I will read this extract to you now because I know some of you have a reader, but feel free to skip past if you don't want to listen to my voice for the next few minutes. So they were very quiet again. At last she said, and in a steady, cheerful voice that only once faltered once, I have known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed. And so have I, cried Peter. Often, and so have I, exclaimed another. So had all. But he was very light to carry, she resumed, intent upon her work, and his father loved him so, that it was no trouble, no trouble. And there is your father at the door. And she hurried out to meet him, and little Bob and his comforter, he had need of it, poor fellow, came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him to it most. Then the 2 young Cratchits got upon his knees and laid, each child, a little cheek against his face, as if they said, Don't mind it, father, don't be grieved. Bob was very cheerful with them, and spoke pleasantly to all the family. He looked at the work upon the table, and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said. Sunday? You went today then, Robert, said his wife. Yes, my dear, returned Bob. I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is, but you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday. My little child, cried Bob. My little child. And he broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he and his child would have been farther apart than perhaps they were. He left the room and went upstairs into the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. There was a chair set close beside the child, and there were signs of someone having been there lately. Poor Bob sat down in it, and when he thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the little face. So this example is from The Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come, and Tiny Tim has died, and he's up in the bedroom, dead, waiting to be buried. So you want to think about how this entire extract shows how the poor struggle. Remember, Tiny Tim's death is needless. When Bob's wage increases, Tiny Tim does not die. So you're thinking about, how does this particular extract show how difficult it was, the life of the poor. Okay, so pause the video now and make your plan. Okay, so what's the essay structure that you're going to follow? So you're going to start off with a focus introduction, 11G1 we call this, a thesis statement in response to the question asked. Make a really strong claim about the relationship between the Cratchits and the struggle of the Victorian poor and explain why it's important. You're then going to write 3 to 4 detailed paragraphs depending on who you are. These are just what, how, why paragraphs. So you're going to analyse your key quote and you're going to compare it to the rest rest of the novella, and then you're going to write a brief conclusion. What have you learnt about the struggles of the poor? What was Dickens's message? Here's an example introduction covering AO1, my understanding of the text, AO2, language features, and AO3, contextual ideas. Dickens constructs the Cratchit family as a method to emphasise the struggles of the poor in Victorian London. So that's a language device because I'm talking about how the Cratchit family are a construct and they are used as a method. Dickens presents the Cratchits as constantly struggling due to the poor wages that Bob receives from Scrooge, struggling to the extent that the disabled Tiny Tim will die if these shadows remain unaltered. However, despite their constant struggle, Dickens shows the Cratchit family to embody the idea of what it is to be Christian, devoted, forgiving and loving, an attitude that contrasts sharply with the attitude of the many of the Victorian middle and upper classes like Scrooge. Okay, so here are some sentence starters to get you started. Okay, so you can pause the video now and use these sentence starters. So you can analyse your 3 quotes and then compare it to the rest of the story. Pause the video now. So here are my top tips for A Christmas Carol. You need to show a sustained focus on the task by using the keyword repeatedly. Struggles of the poor, struggles of the poor, struggles of the poor. You need to use a range of evidence from the extract, at least 3 quotations. You need to use our suggested formula to explore the meaning and effect of the language. So you're using the what, how, why method. So you're saying this suggests that, this implies that, Dickens did this because. You want to use subject terminology accurately once or twice in your response, but remember that can be things like tone, dialogue, repetition, it can be anything. You want to show a clear understanding of the wider plot by including detail, quotes or just precise references from throughout the story. And then you want to make links to the context in which the writer was writing. So for example, Dickens uses the Cratchits to show how unfair Victorian London was organised. You want to include a personal opinion about the content and try to evaluate the character or theme. I felt much sympathy for Scrooge as a child because it shows why. Okay, so you can actually comment on how you think. Those are my top tips.